morning. Um, Welcome to everyone. This is not an easy room to find, so make sure that you have a headphone because we're going to have part of the presentation in Spanish. So if you need a translation, make sure you have one of the sets with you. My name is Francesca Recanatini. I'm a governance specialist here at the World Bank, and I'm here to moderate this panel focused on the relationship between fragility, conflict, and anti-corruption. We have 60 minutes, which already are less than 60 minutes. And so, we wanted to make sure that we give space to the colleagues that they are connected virtually and all the participants listening online and you here. So I will quickly introduce our four panelists very quickly. Their bio are in the program of the Fragility Forum. One request, please mute your phone. Thank you. Our panelists now, you can see them. Send question if you are connected online. We have a chat moderator that can help us with the question. And make sure that you actually, if you have any additional question that we cannot answer to you today or concern, follow up with us. This is a topic that we've been focusing on as a governance and with the fragility team for a while. And so we realized that an hour will not do justice to the issue that we're going to try to cover. So let me start with our colleague here in the room, Mr. Carlos Hernandez, who is the Executive Director of the Association for More Justice Society in Honduras, has been working a lot on the issue of transparency, access to justice, inclusion in Honduras, and has an extensive experience on particularly human rights and anti-corruption in that angle. We then have three more colleagues connected online. I'm going to follow how they appear. There is no particular order. Michael Johnson, who is a professor at Colgate University, who has been working on issues related to corruption for few decades. Let me allow it, let's put it this way, and especially has been increasingly been thinking about how corruption, abuse of powers, and distortion within the governance system can contribute to conflict and prolonged conflict at the country level. We then have our colleague Waziri Adio, who is based in Nigeria. So we have connected from very different time zone and region, and he is actually a very well-known journalist and strategist, political strategist, and has been working as a chief strategy officer for various think tank consult, and was one of the director of the Nigeria Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, and we really welcome him for his knowledge, both working with the government and working with the civil society, and how this can help us to better understand the challenge of fragility and corruption. We then, last but not least, we have Mustafa Al-Haiti, who is connected from Baghdad, and was the director of the reconstruction fund for the area affected by terrorists in Iraq. And he is currently has a different role, but he has been thinking about issue of corruption and fragility in his previous position and for the past 20 years. So we will have Michael Johnson to set the stage for a few minutes on why we think that is important to connect these two areas. And then we're going to ask a few questions to our panelists, and then we will open for you to ask a question. Thank you very much. Michael, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Francesca. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all. And it's a real honor for me to join with you in discussing these important issues. Francesca's work has been a real the work she has done and her colleagues at the bank with immense interest and, for me, immense benefits. I have just a few introductory thoughts to offer, and they are not offered as the way to bridge the gap between our various strategic goals, but rather as maybe one way to try to the FCV cycle in one way or another, but there's been a gap in our thinking, in really two gaps in a couple of ways. One being a gap between stabilization and anti-corruption activities. The other being a gap between top-down and bottom-up initiatives. One of my most recent kinds of issues in my work has been to think about ways in which we would fight corruption with people instead of for people, and what the implications of that might actually be. Too often our stabilization efforts in a system, in a society, have been top down and sort of whole system oriented, while we've not really connected with corruption as an issue as people live it and as they experience it. And too often as well, anti-corruption gets deferred until stabilization somehow takes place, which in many cases it never does. And anti-corruption becomes reduced to a law enforcement initiative, essentially, without looking into its many more important kinds of dimensions. So, in this sense, the question is, how do we integrate top-down and bottom-up sorts of initiatives? How do we integrate the stabilization and anti-corruption pieces? And my argument is that there are ways in which we can and must integrate them. Can and must make them work together. That requires putting people at the center, and my particular emphasis in this is to emphasize the delivery of improved services, facilities, better treatment by officials, as documented and demonstrated by indicators of government performance and benchmarks from time 1 to time 2 to time 3, from one jurisdiction to another. And the kinds of indicators that I have in mind are things like how long does it take to get a license or a permit, the number and the frequency of the business and regulatory inspections, various kinds of prices paid for comparable commodities by governments, petrol, concrete. There are a lot of variations on this. And I've laid this out in some years ago in a backgrounder for the World Development Report that I would be happy to circulate for anyone who's interested in looking at it in more detail. But the key is to demonstrate to citizens that reform is real, that it has an effect improving their daily lives, and that therefore they have a stake in what we are trying to do, both in stabilization and anti-corruption kinds of activities. Speaking as a longtime veteran of the anti-corruption movement, too often our strategy has been to propose anti-corruption reform solely as a public good. Let's fix the corruption problem and everybody is better off. Well, certainly the economists in our midst can see the collective action problems that are created by that kind of sole approach. Now, this indicator and benchmark strategy is potentially stressful in itself. And this is part of course, a larger problem that both stabilization and anti-corruption are very stressful activities. They disrupt accustomed relationships and expectations. They have a way of changing the kinds of alignments that may have satisfied from day to day in a society, but when they break down, of course, the question is what takes their place. So we need to be very mindful about the risk of imposing more stress in the process of trying to do good things. But the core idea with the indicators and civil
Michael?
society, yes. Yes.
We lost you for the last 5 seconds. Sorry.
Yeah.
After you say the core idea.
The core idea is to demonstrate in readily understandable ways that reform is real, that it has benefits for citizens and civil society, that it improves the quality of life in perceptible and measurable kinds of ways, so that reform is not just a great big collective public goods kind of project. To do that means overcoming a variety of kinds of resistance. I have found in proposing these ideas that officials often think I'm arguing for a new corruption index, and I'm definitely not. What I think the indicators and benchmarks offer, in fact, is a chance for officials who manage and govern well to demonstrate that fact and to get credit for it. And a reform effort that involves various kinds of incentives and benefits for officials. There are different kinds of corruption.
Yeah, go ahead. Sometime you're not, and I'm wondering, because you are the best connection that we have, being in the United States. So I'm wondering what is going to happen with our next speaker. Please go ahead. Sorry.
Okay. Just the final point is this indicators and benchmarks approach is potentially disruptive, but it can link citizens to the process. It can link the top-down and the bottom-up efforts that we engage in. As I suggested, this is not offered as the way to proceed against fragility, but it's and achieve some synergy among our different strategies. And with that, I will hand back to Francesca, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Michael. As we say it, and thank you for your strong emphasis on the concrete result and trying to find way when we think about anti-corruption in such fragile context to really focus on what is visible. And thank you for laying out some of the challenges and the trade-off that we need to keep in mind. You mentioned the bottom-up versus top-down type of trade-off that we need to keep in mind, and destabilization versus anti-corruption. If you don't mind, I will pose the first question, Michael, and I will start to pose the first question with our colleague Carlos here in the room, and then we will talk to our other two panelists. When we think, because you actually highlight this, stabilization, anti-corruption. When we think about stabilization and anti-corruption effort, and can we sequence in this type of reform so that the citizen can actually have their needs met? Or are we in sequencing this type of reform trying to stabilize the country that is under some tension and conflict, or trying to address anti-corruption at the same time? Are we creating additional risk when we push for this type of reform?
Okay, perdón, pensé que...
Sorry, I thought you were asking the question to someone else. Thank you. I thought that Michael was going to answer this question first. I simply wanted to make reference to what Michael was saying about this analogy of top-down and from bottom up. For many years, at least in my region in Latin America, the academic world, civil society, and international cooperation agencies have centered on promoting reforms. We have lived in times of many reforms, creating controller entities, loss of access to information, reforms on procurement. However, after almost 2 decades of that, we have assessed this and seen what the corruption indicators are, and we have realized that instead of having confronted the problem in Latin America has become worse. And during the last decade, as a matter of fact, from Argentina, Brazil, and going through Central America, we have seen huge corruption scandals that led to the intervention of international community, for instance, in the case of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, by creating international commissions to confront corruption. Obviously, those of us who work in this area, we ask ourselves, what happened? What happened there? And that's where the other element comes up. What was the participation of citizens in these reforms? And we have to be self-critical and realize that sometimes we managed this from a perspective of an anti-corruption elite. We designed things, but sometimes we forgot the citizens. And that's where I think, well, I like very much the introductory comments made by Michael, because in this new stage, where we are realizing that, for instance, the Corruption Perception Index shows that, unfortunately, the countries with the highest corruption levels in the world are in our region. And so we wonder, what happened? So we have to reflect on this to see how to incorporate citizens into this, because now we see what we have called the time, we're looking at that there's a time of counter-reform. We did reforms, but now from the point of view of power, there's a counter-reform. So we created the law of access to information, and then the governments created confidentiality laws. So we speak about freedom of the press, but they, using, by the way, international convention mechanisms, for instance, the FATF regulations against terrorism financing, but now in civil society, they use some of these elements and this has led to a decrease in civic space. And so participation of citizens becomes increasingly more difficult. This leads us to reflection. And one of the conclusions, and I will finish there, is that it is important to bring in the citizens. It's all about that. And many of the movements we've seen now that have led to a reaction show that we cannot stay only at that level. We have to continue reflecting, we have to continue studying. But as we often say, and we have evidence of this, at least in our region, corruption kills. And corruption is taking away the opportunity for children to have access to education, for the poor to have access to health services. So how to focus on these elements, health, education, for instance, security too, in these priorities, and then based on that, try to have a new movement where citizens can be involved. Thank you.
Gracias. Thank you very much, especially for the emphasis on the role of the citizen. Let me pass the word to our colleague Waziri for the same question. If we think about stabilization and anti-corruption effort, are we creating any additional risk?
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, very well. Thank you.
Okay. Yes. So let me start by talking about what I consider a paradox. And that is that whereas we can draw a straight line between corruption and conflict, it's not too clear that there's such an automatic straight line between pursuing anti-corruption and ensuring peace and stabilization. In actual fact, pursuing anti-corruption can compound stabilization efforts, and we've seen instances of this in different places, not just in Nigeria, but across Africa and in other regions also. This does not mean that anti-corruption is not important, but it also means that we need to pay attention to some other things, including the things that the two previous speakers, have mentioned. So I will give two contradictory or seemingly contradictory answers. Can we pursue both at the same time, or should we be more interested in sequencing? The first answer that I will give is that yes, we can do the two together because the two are very important. You need to pursue anti-corruption. You also need to pursue stabilization at the same time. In a manner of speaking, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. That's my first answer. The second answer, which contradicts that, is that there's always wisdom in sequencing for different reasons. One, there's the usual bandwidth problem. There's limit to how many things you can do at the same time. But apart from that, you also need to pace the work. You need to be able to carry the people along. And for you to be able to carry the people along, you have to be sure where the people are. Is there, because it also depends on the context. What works in Latin America, what works in Western Europe, what works in North America might not necessarily work in Africa. So you need to understand where the people are, where the society is. You need to understand the context, as they say, what is the social, economic, and political context of the area where you are trying to have your intervention. And you also need to understand what the drivers of conflict and insecurity are. In some places where the drivers are as a result of sense of fairness and injustice, pursuing anti-corruption might actually be counterproductive as the first order of business, right? So yes, you need to carry the people along. You need to figure out where the people are. You need to be able to frame and communicate this in a way that you can have all of society approach, so that this is not seen as, oh, this is political vendetta. This is something that is targeted against a particular section of the country or a particular ethnic group, and all of that. So I just want to provide those general answers, and maybe as we move along, I can provide more specific details about how doing good has a cost, and that cost is not just to the individual as doing the good, but also to the society and to the country. And that is the more reason why we have to be very mindful about why we go about it. So what do we do first? And to go back to what Professor Johnson said, if you do a survey and you ask people, should we prioritize anti-corruption or should we prioritize your welfare? I can bet you that in most societies, they will say, we want the dividends of peace. We want the dividends of democracy. So that will be their priority, except you are able to create a link between why they are not having the dividends and corruption. But for most people, they want to move on with their lives. They want better lives, and they want a government that works and a society that works. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Waziri, for such a thoughtful reflection. I really like what you mentioned in terms of the dividend of peace and how we need to do a better job to understand the context and the driver of the conflict and the problem in the country, so that we can actually link those dividends to the corruption issue, which is very important. Dr. Mustafa Ariti, you are the last for this round of question. Based on your experience in Iraq, what could you share with us in terms of the sequencing of stabilization and anti-corruption?
Thank you very much. I can say good afternoon and good evening, for it depends where you are in the hemisphere. The question and the sequence really need to be have, as I found in my experience, that we have 4 key points of stabilization. The heart, the core for the stabilization, we are taking care about the people affected. We need those people really to be safe and to have the basic requirement for their, what you call it, life. So the citizen affected, or maybe the IDPs, internally displaced people, and then we have to think about the stage of the conflict. Is very important. I mean, I cannot apply anything without knowing are we are in the conflict stage or post-conflict stage. This is the second. And then you have to care about the fund, about the money, in order to apply the 4th element, which is the anti-corruption program. For myself, during my work in the reconstruction fund, really, during the conflict phase, I found that taking the people out of the conflict area, displace them to the right places where they feel safe, and we have to provide them with the basic needs like food, water, and shelter. It's very important to save the poor. In this stage, for myself, I wouldn't care about the anti-corruption program because at least there is no standard for the evacuation. You don't know while you are going through a way to take the people to the refugee camp, for example, then anything could happen. So there is no standard method to follow. There is no standard method for the anti-corruption. During this stage as well, less money is going to be spent, but more care is to be taken about the people, the safety of the people in you are carrying or taken to another or shuttling to other places. Then I will have less care about the corruption. So this I call it during the conflict phase. When I go to post-conflict phase, which is the reconstruction and rehabilitation, different ideas will be taken. I will start with the people, the citizen. I will tell them, look, I have such a money. I want to do some project for you to return back to your places. I have to share with them the ideas. This money for this stage is like that. Do you need a school? You need reconstruction of your house? You need the hospital, electricity, water, anything. So in this stage, I am talking to the people to make more confidence with the people taking care about them who are the donor or the government by itself. Once we reach a stage of mutual understanding between the one who offered the, what you call it, the care for them, and give them the kind of selection of the project, it means, and they should understand as well, it is not what we call it a favor from the government. It is the duty of the government or the local government to make their life safe and better, and they have to, what you call it, to live a kind, the stage of democracy, if we can call it by this method. Then, for the second thing in the post-conflict, we have to identify the, what you call a cycle of a procurement and start to apply the standard method of reconstruction, and then what is the existing, what you call rules and regulation, and to work with the BOQs for any projects, and they have to have the citizen and understanding about these projects which are going to be done in their areas, either once they return or during their presence in the shelter where they are or the refugee camps. Second, the international donor or the government They should know the money where it has to be gone, and then we are going to apply what you call it to spend more money than in the post-conflict. Therefore, we have to care more about the money, and we have to have a strict regulation. Then, as I said, the stage of the conflict depends upon how much we are going to deal with those four elements, which I feel it, and we did it, I think, in a good manner, and we have in Iraq a successful story for this process. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Aliti. I would like, Michael, if you don't mind, to actually focus on the second question and share the second question with our panelists. What I heard from the first round of reflection is a focus on people. All of you mentioned the importance of people, citizen, the importance to understand the context, the importance to understand the context in such a way that the intervention really address the conflict and the corruption in a way that bring result to people. Michael, would you like to ask the second question if the connectivity now is a little bit better? And apologies to the audience because apparently we're having some problem today. Please go ahead.
At the moment, I'm hearing everyone quite well, and thank you very much. And by the way, those were excellent kinds of comments, and they remind us that however much we might think of corruption and fragility at a systemic level, when we bring people in and put them at the center of the equation, we're talking about a lived experience, and we're talking about situations that can vary radically from one place in time to the next. And that's not a great insight on my part, but that's all worth remembering. The second question is, I think, a derivative of the first, and that is this: that anti-corruption efforts require reallocating powers. I mean, much
I think that someone is looking after us, and in the moment that we said anti-corruption require reallocation of power, they censor us. Right, Michael?
Okay, so
try one more time.
Okay, thank you very much. And reallocating powers, even as we speak, the anti-corruption and fragility efforts involve reallocating power. That a great deal of corruption rests upon imbalances of power. The many. Addressing that power situation can be
Michael, we lost you again. I might out of being very politically incorrect and disclose where you're based as a way to go after, but I'm not going to do it. Once Michael is back, but because I do think that we're talking about allocation of power and suddenly the internet is not working.
right.
But the question for our three panelists, if I can summarize it, is really when you think about corruption, you reallocate power. In a situation of conflict, dealing with reallocation of powers can create risk. How do you evaluate in your experience? How do you think about the trade-off that there are while you're trying to really push forward an anti-corruption agenda and moving around and redistributing power in an already very difficult context where power is not being distributed in a way that and is not stable, the distribution of power. And let me start again here from our colleague, Carlos. Thank you.
Obviously, our reality in Latin America is a bit different. However, recent studies have indicated that there is an urgent situation regarding the quality of our democracies. and referring to one of those comments we've heard, we had our own spring fighting against corruption in Latin America. However, nowadays we're also seeing contradicting messages coming from Latin America. The new wave of dictatorship at a global scale is happening or coming from our region, unfortunately, from the larger to the smallest countries. And on this question, I would like to focus on a personal experience. Honduras, my country, was one of the most violent countries at a global scale. And one of the elements that were considered in the analysis of the country situation was the corruption in security services. And the response was to eliminate any agency that was related to security. And that was an effort that I was part of. I identified some of those measures. If we eliminate any government institutions that are focusing on public security when drug trafficking and organized crime are present on the ground, what is going to happen to citizens? Will violence grow or decrease? Well, the decision was made to tailor an intervention with the support of civil society. And one of the measures that we believe didn't work, to have a gradual focus or strategy. We cannot eliminate all institutions or agencies. Let's identify from the top to the bottom where are the problems. We'll do it in a gradual way to avoid further destabilization. Additionally, let's work to create a new culture regarding security with other actors. And for this, international cooperation was key. And then to develop a system to monitor and assess the impact of these reforms. Does this have an impact on improving security or transparency? And thirdly, going back to citizens to have efforts focused on awareness, on training, information, to train key actors to understand what are the short, mid, and long-term benefits coming out of these efforts that will allow us to control some hotspots of revolts or violence that could instigate further issues, and then mitigate pushback to these reforms that were being promoted. In parallel, the efforts were focused also on incorporating other groups that represent a great portion of our country, youth, include youth in a creative fashion. Also to incorporate that gender perspective that in some cases, when we talk about security, are not considered. So we made an effort to include gender in this measure. So that's helped us survive one of the most radical reforms that we've seen in the region. More than 6,000 members of the police force were let go. From 12,000, 6,000 were let go. And that was the recommendation. The recommendation was to eliminate all of them. So we were able to survive. We were able to make progress. We're experiencing issues, of course, but we didn't perceive or see that devastating impact that we were expecting from such a radical reform. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Waziri, from your point of view, how to think about supporting anti-corruption reform while destabilizing further the country?
Okay, thank you very much. Two examples that I will give to show that anti-corruption can actually have huge cost. So the fact that you are doing something, you are trying to do something that is good, does not mean that it's cost-free. And the cost can actually be very heavy. In one of our neighboring countries, I will not mention the country to be politically correct, the democratically elected president was planning to institute a probe against one of the military generals And what happened? A coup d'etat took place, and the military took over. And up to now, the democratically elected president is under house arrest, right? Also, at some point in Nigeria, I think around 2016 or so, 2016, 2017, there was some move, for some people, against some people, right? And the oil installations practically, were grounded to a halt. That oil, that used to be the mainstay of the economy of the country, grounded to a halt. So there are many other examples that can be shared. Anti-corruption reformers, their lives can be at risk. People can be in harm's way. People can be killed. And all of that. So, like I said before, this does not mean that anti-corruption should not be pursued, but it's not a decision that should be taken without deep reflection. The first thing is that you need to do a proper power mapping. Since we're talking about allocation of power, to know, definitely somebody is going to be on the losing end, right? Or on the receiving end. Who are these people? How powerful are they? How are they likely to push back? Would they just complain, or are they in control of some, critical segments of the society that can cause further destabilization? So that's very important. It's also very important for anti-corruption crusaders or reformers to expand their toolkits, right? In most instances, we start with the law and order consequence management segment. You start investigating people, you charge them to court, you hold them into jail, and all of that. That is good. There must be consequences for bad action. But there are also other ways in which you can start, especially, because you need to buy time. You need to make sure that you are stable and you are strong. So there are many other areas of anti-corruption fights around maybe disclosure, maybe transparency, and other ways that maybe by introduction of technology, that what you are trying to do is you are trying to prevent corruption from happening, right? So sometimes instead of concentrating too much on what happened in the past, in as much as you need to punish bad behavior and you need to create a disincentive for impunity, maybe what you want to do is how do you make it difficult for people to engage in bad behavior going forward, right? And there are different ways in which you can do that through disclosure mechanisms, through the deployment of technology. That it's not that people will stop being bad, but you're just making it difficult for them, to be able to divert, public resources, to private use. The last point I want to mention is that you also need to invest in communicating this and communicating it in a strategic way, right? You need to mobilize all of society to see that there's value in this. That, even when the other people want to politicize this, we are telling people that the reason why you don't have water, the reason why you don't have good hospital, the reason why you don't have good roads, why you do not have good schools and all of those things is because some other people did bad things that deny you of this. So we need to find a very visible, visceral way of communicating things and showing people the opportunity cost of corruption. Because sometimes you also live in some societies where people have a very problematic relationship with the state. They see the state as the place where people go and help themselves. And they see corruption as a kind of bloodless crime. Well, you are not hurting anybody, you're just taking whatever, you're just helping yourself. But we are trying to communicate this is to say, no, somebody has taken what belongs to you. You are suffering because somebody has cornered all this commonwealth. And your future has been mortgaged because of all of this. So framing, communicating, expanding the toolkit and doing proper power mapping, which goes back to the issue of sequencing. So how do you proceed? Do you proceed with those things that can, throw everybody out and you are not on the seat to be able to prosecute your agenda? Or do you want to put some other measures in place that they will not even know what is going on. But by the time they know what you have put in place, it's too late and the game has changed.
Thank you. Thank you, Waziri, for very thoughtful consideration. I especially find helpful your suggestion to really do this power type of analysis and to really understand, I will say it, the landscape around you when you're trying to think about implementing some of this reform, and how also the other reflection that really resonate with me and that too often we don't take into account is the importance of the communication, the importance of engaging with people, the importance of communicating and explaining the reform, the impact, and why this is happening. So thank you very much. Dr. Mustafa, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Again, the policymaker should consider, for me, three elements in order to fulfill the anti-corruption program. And we are now, as I said before, we are in the post-conflict stage. It is not during the conflict. We are now going to another stage. First of all, the policymaker, select the right leader for the, what you call it, reconstruction fund or the project managers. Second, selection of the right employee for the project. And third, reviewing the area from which the corruption can come to the system. For the first stage, selecting the right leader, you have to think about the morals of the leader, the past services, the ethics, and his experience in working with different people at different levels. Selecting the right employee, I mean, his task is the leader selected. Second, knows when and how to act when employees do not perform as expected. The area which is very important, or the weak points in the reconstruction, which should be considered and to be reviewed, is reviewing what we call the BOQs. Very important, really, because here in the first step, if the BOQs is not right regarding the pricing, regarding the elements in there, exaggeration of the pricing, which in this case, corruption started. So from the very beginning, reviewing for validation of the BOQs. Now, the second thing, which is the bureaucratic method. Usually in our areas, there is a long bureaucratic time. So we have to think and reserve the time for executing the project. If it is too long, it means the services is not going to get to the people in the right time, or at least there will be a corruption, especially when you give a down payment to the contractor and all these things. Anyone who is working in this field know what does it mean, the bureaucratic method. Third, again, ensuring the citizens are engaged in selecting the type of project. And they have the right to express their opinion without being punished through direct interaction with the head. So there must be kind of a transparency, and they feel there is no, what you call it, they are not hitting the red lines. So when they are in the first stage selecting the right project for them, they have to be, what you call it, continuing to come and to go and to see the project. And they are going to feed back the, what you call it, there is what we call it, the hotline with the top manager of the project without fear from saying anything or condemning the contractor kind of work, then in this case, I think we are going to change, or at least to minimize the risk of corruption. It is the leader's job as well to ensure that the employees feel that they are also held accountable for how and what they are reporting to. This is very important for they can. Always in our countries, the processing, again, taking too long time, it means, wow, if you are going to accelerate it and doing that and that, they pay what you call it and start the fraud. So their reporting is honest and objective and based on fact, not on opinion or for the sake of downgrading their peers or their manager. So I think all these points should be taken in consideration in order for the policymaker to have what you call it, the right organization and the job to be done in the right way, and then applying the rules in any country for fighting the anti-corruption. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's very good overview of what we need to think. And I think that our three panelists really help us to think both in terms of the importance of strengthening the institution that support security, rule of law, as the example of Honduras was giving us, involving citizen and thinking about actual trade-off, and then really thinking in terms of the detail of how you manage this trade-off that there is apparently between anti-corruption and stabilization by focusing on involving people, but selecting the right project, the right people involved, and really think about the people side. We have a very interesting question. Apologies to my panelists, because it's gonna be a little bit of a, let's see if they translate it well, curveball to the panelists. But we have a very interesting question coming from the one of the participants online that I would like to pose, and also to check if there is anybody in the room that would like to have a question. I can see a lot of hands, and I'm sure that you're going to get late for lunch, I'm sure. So the question that we receive is, what do we do going forward, knowing that the international agency are sometimes complicit in corruption at the higher level, or might turn a blind eye to it, as long as access to local decision maker and some other measure of progress continues? So that's why I decided to a little change in plans. Let me also collect a couple of questions, and then I will give the the floor to our three panelists to answer. I saw Heather's hands. I saw, yes, I saw Catherine.
Hi, I'm Heather Marquette, University of Birmingham, and seconded as an academic to the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. And hello, Michael. I could do a happy dance right now listening to the panel because I'm so excited by everything that you've heard. But one of the things I'm doing right now with colleagues at FCDO is we're refreshing the UK's guide to stabilization. And you're lifting, I thought it's a hat trick, we're calling it prioritization as policy fratricide. So when you have competing policies and tensions and trade-offs, we talk about power and mapping and context and all of that, but also there's a new spread on corruption and anti-corruption that has as a subtitle, First Do No Harm, taken from Michael's WDR paper. But one of the things that we're also doing is redefining stabilization, where it isn't an umbrella term. So it doesn't include reconstruction. It doesn't include state building. It doesn't include long-term development, but it's about the 4 Ps. So preventing imminent threat of violence or escalation, protecting the basic means of security, promoting political process to end the violence and preparing for longer term stability. And I was just wondering from the panelists if that reframing helps to do some of the things you're talking about, which are quite hard when we think of stabilization as one thing, as opposed to separate phases where you might prepare and think about anti-corruption differently, including the issue that's so vital that everybody talked about a conflict sensitivity and what that means as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Heather.
Thank you. My name is Catherine Shezit, and I specialize in third-party monitoring for Integrity Global. And thank you to all of the panelists for the very thoughtful and thought-provoking comments and reflections. I have a question for Mr. Hernandez, and it's much more practical, I think, in nature. If I understood you well, you mentioned that one of the reforms was the reduction by 6,000 police officers, and that there had been concerns of what the impact that would bring. And to me, immediately, I was thinking, oh my gosh, that's a livelihoods problem. So I was wondering if you could offer more reflections on why it seemed to work well, why you didn't see some of the negative repercussions. Was that because there was a reemployment program? Were there any lessons that you could share about why that seemed to be successful? Thank you.
Thank you. I thought that I saw another end, but yes, please, the last one, and then we have to wrap up, otherwise they're going to kill me.
Don't worry at all. I am Jorge, a Mexican based in New York. I collaborate in an organization named Agora. I participate in UN meetings, speaking with public officials about the necessity to incorporate peace-building policies related to social justice, to address inequalities, etc. UNODC invited our organization to participate at a side event at the corruption forum happening in November where was that? Yeah, well, in the US. And I was able to speak with many public officials about this topic. However, from what I've heard, there's been a lot of reforms, programs aiming to address this problem. And at least in my country, Mexico, there doesn't seem to be a solution to the problem after 6 years when the president was elected and his promise was to tackle corruption, even though that's not what he followed. So the problem with Mexico and most of the countries in Latin America, from my perspective, is the existence of illegal markets that are fueling corruption activities among national and international officials. And when you look at the corruption dynamics in Mexico, it's addressing the question that was made online. It is difficult to find a separation between criminal organizations and public officials or companies, right? It is cultural, as we were mentioning. So given the existence of illegal markets, if there is a plan to address or to implement public policies to address corruption without legalizing or keeping the market illegal, how are we going to move forward?
Thank you. Very difficult question. You have a set of very difficult questions. I'm going to start with Carlos in the room and then move. Let's see if Michael can also jump in. Let's keep it a few minutes each so each of you can, and then we're going to wrap up. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. As to the first question, I'm going to focus on this. I think the greatest challenge is that international organizations negotiate directly with countries and governments. In our case, in our countries, public officials are the biggest liars that have no credibility. Most of them are corrupt and are linked to organized crime. So what happens then is we see those results we're seeing right now. Secondly, my organization is monitoring the recent agreements that were signed with international organizations. When we see the conditions that are set by institutions such as the IMF, conditions set for the country, and then we assess or evaluate what happens in reality, I need to be very subtle, but they have been postponed. So why do we set these conditions? What are their implications? I could talk more about this, but then how can we identify mechanisms that allow us to incorporate other sectors? Because at the end of the day, it's not only them. All of us have to bear the responsibility that have been signed on to by our governments with international organizations. However, we're not involved in the process. Some of us try to get involved without asking for permission, but it's still very complicated. Now, that curveball, we had the highest homicide rate, and many of the violence perpetrators were actually part of the armed forces or the government institutions that were responsible for security. There was no bandwidth to design a program. We had to be as objective as possible. It was a complicated context, and it was difficult to let them go. And they didn't go to jail. We did not have the ability to ensure due process. So in this case, criminals that had weapons, a uniform and authority, were stripped from their weapons, uniforms, and authorities. And then they went to continue operating, but without that backing from being part of the state institution. So they were let go, they received any kind of compensation, but we didn't have a mechanism in place. As years have gone by, we've noted that violence has not increased, it's actually decreased. We are no longer in those dire conditions. And we believe that that process allowed us to help the country achieve stability and reduce its violence.
Jump in just for a couple of quick reflection and answer to the question that we have received. No, until we find out if the connection is still there, why don't we move on to Waziri? Waziri, you heard the question. It's quite a set of very difficult questions. If you can share some of your thoughtful reflection with us.
Yeah, thank you very much. I don't think I can answer all the questions, but I would just provide three key answers. The first one is that we need to be also mindful of the fact that sometimes people are fatigued, right? They're tired. They're tired of hearing the same thing over and over again. They just want their lives to be better, right? And we need to concentrate effort on how to do that. That's the first one. The second one is that, yes, the reframing is quite necessary. And I think for all parties, all the key actors in the space, not just from FCDO, and other countries and development partners, but also from the government actors and people in civil society and the media, right? We need to be thinking about what works, what doesn't, and what we need to do differently. And I'm sure that in every, there's no point just trying to do the same thing over and over again and just hoping that we get a different outcome. So we need to keep looking at these issues, with new eyes, and also benefiting from the experience we have acquired over time, both internationally.